Well, it is no surprise to most of our listeners, I imagine, that it is getting hotter and drier. And we need to start thinking about what does that mean for garden design.
And it's really hot today, isn't it?
Oh, it's a cracker. It's about 32 degrees out there and it's just...
in the shade.
Yeah, and it's going to be 36 on Saturday.
It sure is. So
that's Celsius,
summer
by the way.
Is seriously here. Yeah, that's right. We are obviously in the Southern Hemisphere and in Canberra. And in the beginning of December, which is just has hit us with a huge amount of summer already.
Well, to get a little bit of help on this, because, we're not necessarily experts in dry, hardy gardens, we've got a fabulous special guest today. So I'm really excited that we are joined today by a horticulturist and designer, Jackie Warburton.
Great. So welcome to the On Garden Design podcast with Fleur and Sachi, where we chat about what makes a garden great and we try to inspire and make designing accessible to anyone who's interested in gardens. Your hosts are longtime friends, Fleur and Sachi, who bring a fresh perspective and their life experience to designing gardens as a second career. And just to remind you all, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram, and make sure you follow us on Spotify so you know when the next episode is available. We're also available on Apple and anywhere else that you might get your podcasts. So we've got Jackie here. Let's say hi to Jackie.
Hi, how you going?
It's so fun to have you here, Jackie. Oh. Now, let me just give a little introduction so our listeners know who you are. Mm-hmm. So Jackie's had a long career as a horticulturist and professional gardener. And in fact, I first met Jackie a few years ago when we were both at University of Canberra studying landscape architecture.
And I met Jackie, who was dealing with thrips in my garden.
That's right. Yeah, so I've met both of you in different ways.
And injecting your trees with
that's right. And elm beetle.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so Jackie is bridging from her horticultural background into garden design now, which is really exciting because she brings to our podcast today that depth of horticultural knowledge as well as a design and how to apply it in a design way. But also just to say, Jackie is well known for her contribution to the community on plant knowledge, and she speaks on ABC Canberra Radio gardening show as well as a number of other community presentations, and particularly specialises in succulents and cactus.
And she also writes for City News.
Fantastic. Well, look, you know what? We shouldn't keep our listeners waiting because Jackie's the one with all the knowledge here.
She sure is.
So what are we going to ask her today?
So we've got a number of questions, and we're really going to go through plant choices, some design considerations, and a bit of advice to people who are designing their gardens as well. So give us your criteria, Jackie, for choosing a plant for drought hardy and dry gardens. How about that?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing for me is that it's got to be a perennial plant. It's got to give bang for your buck. It's not just going to be an annual that's going to grow and set seed and die in the first year. So you want something that's going to have longevity, and that a plant that grows a lot slower, so therefore it's not faster to die as well. So really tough, hardy perennial plants are probably my main choice.
Can I just ask a question? Because let's be clear, because I always get confused. What is a perennial plant over an annual plant?
Well, a perennial plant is a plant that grows more than 1 year.
Yeah.
So quite often your herbaceous perennial is something that you might have in a cottage garden where you chop it down to the ground in the beginning of autumn and then it reshoots in spring. So a perennial garden is a tree, is something that grows more.
That's the thing that makes it so confusing. It goes from everything to, some little clumpy thing to a tree.
Yeah, so
it's
that's
a huge
right.
range.
And then to confuse things, there are biennials in there as well, but we won't go into them too much today. So they're plants that live for 2 years or maximum 3 years and then die. But generally a perennial plant, you're really going to get something for 10 to 15 years or longer. So, sometimes some of these plants can be a little expensive, but they're really worth their weight in gold because they can be some of the structural plants that you really need in the garden.
Yeah, and so you're thinking about structure in your dry garden as well.
Well, you have to, that's right, because those sorts of structures actually give you the microclimate and the protection from the hot winds and those sorts of things. So you've got to be mindful of planting things, in our environment, sort of on the westerly side to protect from the winds that come from the west. And different things like that certainly make a big difference. But and choosing plants that have multiple features seasonally, it's got to give you good impact in the autumn, good impact in the winter time, and flowers maybe in the spring, and good foliage in the summer. So it's a plant that can really fit and tick all of those boxes.
That's an interesting point on perennials, because when I think of perennials, I think that they really are suited to sort of late spring, summer and a bit of autumn, and then they sort of don't give much in winter. So when you're talking about an all-year garden and perennials, are there perennials that do give a pack-a-punch in winter?
Well, there are. There are things like a Garrya elliptica, which is a tassel fern, and beautiful foliage and flowers in the middle of winter.
It's a fern. Is it going to grow in drought?
No, it's really tough. It's of the olive family, so a really, really tough plant. So there are things that you can choose that give you that. And crepe myrtles, even though they're a tree, they can look beautiful in the winter if they're pruned aesthetically.
Yep.
And so I like to prune mine into triangles, and they look lovely. And then I get bored, and then I change them and prune them into circles or something. But you know,
I was thinking iris a bit, because I take all the little twigs off, so I've got a really sculptural frame.
That's perfect. Yeah, it does my head in if they're there. So that's how we can enhance the features of winter plants and make them just as beautiful in the winter, and the silhouette that you see in the winter on plants that are deciduous. But perennial plants can be a little bit boring in some seasons, but they've really got to carry their weight, whether they are going to create a microclimate or provide flowers or habitat at the right time of year.
Yeah, better than an annual, which just kind of, is a flash in the pan and it's gone again.
Well, that's right. And they can be a little expensive, but there always is a place for annuals, so that could be a little bit of potted colour for the outdoor table, or annuals are very good around the vegetable garden and those sorts of things. So it's always good to have a few annuals around, but certainly perennials are. And the perennials are very good because they have a very long, good soil structure. So therefore, in large gardens where there might be some soil erosion, you've got the root structure of the plant will actually hold the soil together. So some plantings can be very good for erosion and slopes and things like that.
Oh, that's handy to know, particularly in
it's good to sort of really start thinking about perennials and all the differences that come within perennials. So do you find that there's certain garden design styles that lend themselves to this kind of dry, hardy plant choices?
Well, rockeries are very good because the plants that we use in there are generally shallow-rooted plants that can have their roots cooled by the rocks, and that makes the plants sit quite well. It makes the water go through them quite well. So some of the other gardens are endemic gardens, not necessarily native gardens. So we're very blessed in Canberra to have the Australian Botanic Garden. So, that's a big, beautiful garden that is lovely designed since 1974, I think it's been there for. So it's a really good example of not only native gardens but exotic gardens and endemic plants that we have in Canberra. I think.
So what do you mean by endemic?
Endemic means that the native plants are from our region.
Right.
So we can have a native garden and we could have some...
So the local natives.
Yeah, that's right. So local natives are endemic to this area, whereas your natives, you can have Western Australian flowering natives or something in your garden. But so some of the drought hardy plants you can really focus on. Go for a walk in the bush. We are so close to the bush, and we can replicate some of those plants into our garden space, and the water use is a lot less than what it would be if it was in a different environment. So go for a walk and have a look at what we have.
I think that's a really good point because we've got listeners from 42 countries, and so I think the key message out of that is have a look in your own neighbourhood and your own bush area, your own woodland or forest, and see what is endemic to your climate. So that's going to be better in terms of response to your environmental conditions, your, I guess the areas that get a lot of drought.
Well, that's right. And a lot of plants will just naturalise, and they won't necessarily self-seed, or the wrong plants won't self-seed, the right plants will self-seed. And it gives the soil a really good balance. So, I think looking at some of the endemic plants. And
I just want to make sure that people are thinking, though, when they go out and they have a look, because I live near a bit of bush, and at the moment we've got all of the St John's wort coming out in beautiful yellow flowers. They are a weed, so be really clear about what is actually a native or an endemic species versus a weed that is pretty, because my partner's very good at going out and taking photos of the weeds because he doesn't know what he's looking at, and they can often be quite pretty too.
Well, that's right. And although we haven't seen any this season, but Patterson's Curse was introduced into Australia as a beautiful garden plant and great for the bees. But once it hits the bushland, not so good for the
livestock.
Yeah. So when we do get drier conditions, we do have Patterson's Curse, and when we have slightly wetter conditions, we have St John's wort. So we can actually tell by looking at some of the flora and fauna around in the bushland to the types of seasons that we're having, and best to mitigate them. So we know we're coming up to a dry season because the St John's wort was quite vibrant this year. So we know we're coming into a dry period.
Now we're talking about drought and dry hardy sort of gardens here, and it's interesting we've got this far. We haven't even mentioned succulents and cactus.
Yes, I know. I've tried my very best.
I bet you're just dying to share something on them because this is your real specialisation, this area. And I guess because with the conversation we were having that we're looking sort of particularly at endemic species and that therefore they'd be likely to respond more to your climate. Where does succulents and cactus fit in that? Because I don't think they're very endemic to Canberra.
No. In fact, there are no native cacti to Australia. So we only have native succulents, calendrinias and carprobutus and a few of those sorts of things. And there's lots of other ones that we do have. But generally, but cactus come from regions that are very similar to our climate, so the South African species or things like that. So they like it hot and dry and can cope with quite some frost. So we tend to find that those plants grow generally well in our environment. There are much more variety of cactus and succulents that will grow in other regions, but there certainly is a really large amount that will actually grow here. And trying to buy and grow plants locally that have acclimatised will certainly help. So quite often buying plants from nurseries, the plants aren't propagated here or they're not grown here, so we get them through our first winter and then they don't grow as successful as we would like. So trying to purchase a lot of those types of plants from garden clubs and small local nurseries that would support some of those nurseries and growers that grow in a cool climate will certainly go a long way to the longevity of growing plants.
Now, can I just go back to garden design styles that lend themselves to the sort of the drought hardy things? We've talked about rockeries, and I guess the kind of thing that comes into my head is some of the modern contemporary type gardens as well, where you see a lot of the yuccas and the really, the cockroaches of the plant world is the way I like to think of them. The things
but also survive. Really ornate cactus.
Yeah, exactly.
I paid $400 for a yucca. I like it. The most expensive plant I've ever bought.
Okay, I'll just take my foot out of my mouth. So are there other design styles that you would sort of,
Look, one of my favourites is the Scandian, the Nordic garden. So they have long winters and short summers, and some of their gardens are really showing lots of grasses and things. So I learn a lot from that because in Canberra we have our first frost in Anzac Day, which is the end of April, and we have our last frost in Melbourne Cup Day, which is the first week of November. So we have 7 months of potential minuses. So we need to really be mindful of how to keep our plants, surviving through those colder periods. And if the soil does freeze in that time, how fast is that soil going to thaw out and cause damage to the plants? So the Nordic and Scandinavian gardens are just my favourites.
Can you describe what you'd see in a Nordic or Scandinavian garden?
Well, lots of grasses, lots of like salvias, and lots of natural beech woods and grey woods and things like that. Very little concrete. I think they're very naturalistic style gardens, and to me, I see them as beech gardens. So with lots of flowing foliage.
So you're talking about beech trees. You're not talking about the ocean at the moment. Just to check that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, that's right.
Good.
So,
just really,
Scandinavian, just really naturalistic, and you feel comfortable within the space. Yeah. And they're not a structured garden. They're a bit like a grown-up meadow garden, I think. But lots of natural materials are used within their garden, so they're quite harmonious. And
we might see if we can find a photo and stick it up on Instagram when we post this episode.
What about cottage garden styles? Is that something that's suitable for a dry hardy garden?
Well, it is, and we're finding a lot of notable designers around Australia and the world are changing from that classic cottage style to adding a lot of drought hardy plants into those sorts of things. So the Australian gardens, like the Monaro Gardens of the south of Canberra, some of the English Australian countryside gardens are just absolutely beautiful, where there has been a mixture of natives and exotics, and they just grow what survives. And if something grows well, multiply it. I think that's really one of the key things to say.
That is, that's like number one rule almost, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I always buy two plants and I put it in two different spots, and then so if I lose it in one spot, I can learn from that. But yeah, so they're definitely, you know, my takeaway things for today. Yeah.
So what are some other plant combinations that would work well in a dry and drought hardy garden?
Mediterranean plants, so you're looking at salvias and your oreganos and things like that. So they're not only necessarily herbs that you would have in the herb garden. You can put a creeping thyme as in between the stepping pavers and things like that. So it's great for the bees; they flower. So some of those Mediterranean ones would be there, you know, for that. A South African plant, some of the bulbs that grow in the cooler months of the year. So, you know, you'll have bulbs that will grow in the winter or the spring, and as soon as the hot weather comes, they start to die down. So thinking about some of those plants that actually give you bang for your buck outside the peak heat season. So you're not
winter flowering bulbs you're talking about?
Yes, that's right.
Well, give us an example.
Nerines will come up in the autumn time. Yep. You've got your belladonna lilies, your naked ladies. They'll come up. They'll have their green foliage right through winter, but then they'll die down in the hot summer. So you've got plants like your irises that they do everything they need to do in the winter and in the spring, and then they almost go dormant in the summertime. So for drought hardy gardens, we look at plants that sit dormant and use less water in the summertime, but then do all of their growing when they don't need as much water.
That's a really good point.
So really being able to sort of change our psyche on not trying to have an English garden, you know, throughout our summer, but just let summer be a time of dormancy.
Yes, that's right.
And it's a real mind shift, because I think a lot of us want to have all year round exciting garden, but maybe we actually need to say, let it. That's part of a drought hardy garden design approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then that's where your perennial plants will come into play in the summertime. And of course, you can have flowering liliums or your Christmas lilies and things like that. But they're just a couple of flowering bulbs that really give you that punch that you might need, you know, in the garden. But focus on a lot of flowering things to be outside our main heat summer season. So therefore, we use less water.
So let's get into sort of a bit of a plant list before, and then move off plants. So what are your top drought hardy plants, and sort of for different, I guess, categories almost, Jackie? So like, you know, what are the good ones that are good for foliage? What are the good ones for flowers? What are the good ones for shade, screening, structure?
Well, foliage, my first one would be Beschonoria yuccioides, and it is just an amazing plant. It's a false agave, and it grows well here, and it's just got lovely, dramatic, strappy leaves on it with this gorgeous flower spike. And we don't use those sorts of things very often, but having a very good sound plant knowledge, when I look at a magazine, I can pick what the name of the plant or get pretty close to what that is, and then try and find something that I know that will grow in our region to give you that same aesthetic look. But definitely.
So that's not one of those, though, that after it flowers the plant dies.
No. So that's some agaves will do that.
That's right.
But definitely not the
Not the false agave.
No. So
sounds
look,
like a good
things
one. We
like
might post a picture of that one.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, and you know, Fatsia japonica. That's one of my favourites. That's great for shade. You know, they
terrible name.
It is, yes, it is. But they actually mixed that with ivy and got a sterile, large leafed fatsia called a fat shedderer, which is an even worse name.
I'm picking up these names.
Yeah, and it's quite unusual.
Shedding fat, that's not a bad one. Fat shedderer.
Fat shedderer. So it's a combination of ivy and fatsia, and the flowers and the foliage are just tenfold to
Does it cling to it like ivy? Does it actually climb?
Yes, it does.
Oh,
yes,
I've got to look that one up.
Yeah, so
absolutely.
it's absolutely fabulous.
And for shade areas?
And it's very unusual because it's very hard for two genuses to come together. So there's very few plants in the plant world that do that. can't go past the salvias, lavenders, the catnips, the atriplex, the hakeas, fire retard plants. I think, we always need to be mindful of the firestorms and how quickly fires can move. A lot of us are, still remember the 2003 fires that we had here, and it was really interesting to see what survived and what didn't. And so I'm very nervous about putting a lot of natives and grasses really close to homes and houses, because if they do catch fire, they catch fire really fast.
It's a really good point.
So,
and also the natives that have a lot of oil in them, because we do have quite a few. They are highly flammable.
Yeah, so going back to those fires, there were some homesteads surrounding Canberra that survived purely because there were exotics planted close to the homestead, and there was an expansive lawn. I mean, people might not think that that's very suitable, but it slows a fire down if that's a problem. And this is where succulents can be very useful. That you can actually, succulents are very good because they store water in their leaves. So therefore, if there is a fire coming, and then you've got a large expanse of ground cover of any type of succulent, it's going to slow the fire down. It may not necessarily stop it, but anything to get in the way of a fire is a good thing. So succulents are good for that as well.
Important in Australia, where we're very close to the bush in many places.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, before we move on to design considerations, is there any other plant ones? I didn't want to cut you off.
Look at flowers. I love oleanders.
So do I.
They people say that they are poisonous, but a daffodil is poisonous. There are so many poisonous plants. But here's for you, Satra. I love my oleanders next to my yuccas. Because I've got oleanders in this vibrant red, and my yuccas that are white flowers, and they just really give you that punch. So they're my two combinations that I really like together.
Well, I'm not having tea at Jackie's house anymore.
So crepe myrtles again. That's another signature plant that I just love. And the flowers, so salvias, herbs, all of those sorts of things. Yep.
That's a terrific list. And I think what's great about that is we've got a whole range of different looking plants in that, and some for shade, some for sun, and just the different type of flowering colours and palettes that you can have. So, you've really given us a lot to be able to work with there. So it goes to show that if you're going to design a drought hardy garden, you're not just beholden to a few plants. You're actually
spiky, dry-looking ones.
Range.
Exactly.
Well, no, that's right, and it's about the soil as well. So it's about building some berms or swales. So then, when we do get the rain, that the moisture in the rain actually percolates slowly through the soil to get to the roots where it needs, and not sort of run off. So it's not only plant choices; it's about the undulation of the soil, and the site aspect is just as important as well.
Absolutely, that's critical. Let's move into design consideration, and I guess this is probably my question, because, as I said, I'm not a huge cactus succulent fan, and we often see drought hardy and dry gardens as pretty uninviting, and I think it's because that's how people have classically developed these things, where they are all hard and spiky, and I always get this kind of fleshy coloured thing in my head as opposed to lush green. I don't know why. It must be
sort of seraphitic gardens that we were.
Yeah, and they're often this kind of fleshy colour. I don't know why that's in my head, but the echeveras and some of the aloes as well, they often have that kind of colour. But anyway, how can you make sure that if you've got a drought hardy garden, you're actually creating something that's inviting and potentially lush and green and gives you a sense of garden, as opposed to you walking into a desert landscape?
Yeah, well, I think it's having soft plantings and having the spiky plants, or if you've got some large cactus at the back of the garden bed, where you can see the silhouette and you can actually see the beauty of each plant on its own. But, a perfect example, if people are ever in Canberra, is to have a look at the succulent garden up at the National Arboretum, and that is a perfect example of how a cactus garden will look on its own. But a cactus garden doesn't necessarily just only have to have cactus or succulents in it. So you certainly can mix it up a little bit with some of those salvias and some of those grey-leafed foliage plants, just to soften some of those greens and to just give it a little bit of oomph. But so not necessarily all just cactus, but I personally think that just a cactus garden looks pretty spectacular on its own. But I'm a little bit of a different gardener. I have a rose garden, I have a herb garden. I don't have and a native garden. I have all different separate gardens. I never have a combination of roses in with, the exotics and everything. So my gardening's a little unconventional, unfortunately, but that's my garden.
You triggered me into thinking that roses are actually a really good choice for a dry, hardy
They're
garden.
going to come back with a bang.
Yeah.
They really are. When I first started my horticultural career, it was the drought time, and some of those carpet roses and the ground cover roses that were just so very popular, and they just flower for 8-9 months of the year if you can get them into a good spot, and you get the hedge trimmer or the chainsaw out, once a year, and you so they're good for anybody. So I really think roses are really going to come back in vogue.
Yeah. And they're very undemanding, aren't they?
They are, yeah.
Apart from a bit of pruning to make sure they don't look super
they need
leggy.
good pruning maybe once a year, and then tip pruning after that. But the fragrance, they're lovely for a gift or a vase in the kitchen, So I find them very versatile. Not necessarily climbers. I think climbers generally only just sort of flower once and do that. But your cut and come again roses, like your hybrid teas, which are generally a rose on a tall stem, they are fantastic. But then you've got your delbards and as some of the flowers that have rose hips, that they can flower for months and months of the year. So I really think roses are going to come back into vogue. I really do believe that. Yeah.
Watch this. Jackie's just predicted a trend in gardening.
Oh, no, this is wonderful, because I think a lot of our listeners are really relating to some of these plant choices. Because, when we first thought about this episode, we were thinking kind of dry, spiky stuff. Whereas really, Jackie's giving us that whole suite and variety of, there's a lot of different options here that you can make. You can really dry-proof your garden without compromising on a lot of beauty, aesthetic and fragrance that we really love. You've been to a lot of gardens because of the nature of your entire career, and now more so thinking about the design side of things. What have you seen most that have been real fails in the design side for drought and getting your gardens more kind of hardened up for this dry that we're entering
I
into?
just think it's the wrong plant choices, and we find unfortunately that there's a lot of architects are the ones that actually do the plant choices for a lot of designs, and I find that extremely frustrating, because they just bung a few of this and bung a few of that, whereas I tend to redo what they've done, because architects don't know plants. I do think that to better educate landscape designers to also be plants people, because as Fleur and I know, that horticulture was not taught in landscape architecture, and that was just mind-boggling for me. That I had biology, so I learned how to dissect cane toads and worms, but as to actually learning what the difference was between a tree, a plant, a shrub or a herb was just not in our curriculum, and I thought that was very disappointing at the time. It's about educating people that are doing design to actually know their plants. The information is out there. There's books out there. There's podcasts like this one to learn from. The information is there.
So the key learning is really for people who are listening to this who want to employ a designer, ask your designer about plants and see and almost test their knowledge, making sure that they are someone who has a good plant knowledge.
The hardscape is important, but to me, the softscape is just as important. The softscape is what gives you the wow factor and gives you the interest all year round. The concrete or the walls are there to support the softscape, not the other way around in my world.
It's interesting, though, when you think about drought-hardy gardens, I think a lot of people and landscapers have a tendency to do a lot of paving and then a lot of gravel and a lot of kind of hard surfaces and less about the plants. So are we seeing this sort of drive or move in landscape design towards creating more hardscaping?
Well, I thought it was a little more hardscaping in the past, where, we had four-chord lines and some stones, and I think we're moving away from that, and people want to grow meadow gardens and bee-friendly gardens and that. So I think we're now tending to not have things in lines. We tend to be having, sort of wide gardens and plants plopped in around the place, opposed to the minimalist style. So I think we're adding more softscape to our hardscape now. But I think there are lots of regulations where there has to be a certain amount of permeable surfaces on a certain site. So 40% or 60%. I think the more permeable surfaces we can have, that includes gardens. It could be some paths as well. But I think we're moving around to having more softscape than hardscape than what I've seen over the years.
And I think if we just think about sort of the design considerations, and Jackie, I'm going to draw on you something that you said to me just recently. Paul Bangay has also said to people, think about not having two hardscape elements next to each other. Always have a softscape next to your hardscape to soften that and make sure it feels like a garden or a tennis court.
Yes, yep, that's right.
Yeah.
And the surfaces, they're reflective, so, if you want to use gravel, don't use white gravel, it's reflective. So using more organic colours and you'll find slate is a heat sink. So, so using your natural materials to help you with that as well.
So this is now getting into those things that are really practical for people like me who just think about maintenance all the time because it's time poor. So how much maintenance is usually involved in a drought-hardy garden?
Well, I think it depends on setting it up properly and making sure that, if you are going to build it from scratch, that the soil is very good and that it is weed-free and that you put mulch down. Mulch does suppress weeds. It keeps some moisture in the soil. It keeps the temperature from fluctuating. So all of those sorts of things certainly do help.
Is there a particular type of mulch that you'd recommend for drought-hardy gardens?
Good question.
Well, in my succulent gardens, I like scoria because it's a volcanic rock, and as it does slowly break down, it adds rock minerals. So I think forest litter is a good product, which is very popular in our region because it is the green waste is that people take to the tip is processed and then sold back to the garden. So it's 100% organic.
Complete with all those bits of plastic.
It does have lots of plastic and bits and pieces, but look, the good thing is that the plastic and all the debris does rise to the top, so then it can be sifted out. But it's organic and it breaks down and adds organic matter to the soil.
And we're recycling, so it's sustainable.
That's right. Yep, and it's cheap. It's probably $30 to $40 a cubic metre cheaper than all the others. But it does depend on the site aspect, the wind, all of those sorts of things. So there are plenty of products. Bark is not going to be beneficial to the soil, but going to be there aesthetically. So it depends on how you're going to maintain the garden, how long you're going to be in the garden for, whether you're selling a house, then it just depends on the different surfaces.
Yeah, and so when it comes to, when we think of drought-hardy garden, like we're trying to set up a garden that can cope with dry, hot periods, should we put
like how it
irrigation
has to be dry and hot, not just dry and hot.
Oh, it's all about emphasising it's scorching out there. So, is putting in irrigation what we need to do, or are we setting up plant choices here that actually just don't require irrigation?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, and I think having drip irrigation where it drips onto the soil surface and we're not spraying, with the rainmaker or anything like that, and watering at the most appropriate times of the day, so watering in the morning time, but also having really good soil, so making sure that your soils have lots of rock minerals and that the soil is not compacted and
organic matter.
Yeah, that's right, and has good airfill porosity is what they call it. So therefore the root systems can actually move through the soil structure quite well. And organic matter, increasing the worms, all of those sorts of things. So, you might have some plants that will actually really dry out in the heat of the day, but the root system is cool. So providing a good soil structure that the roots can stay cool with lots of mulch, then so it's a bit of both. And watering should be done less and less as the plants do mature. And if you're finding that you are watering something too much, then that could be an issue, that it's the wrong site aspect. We may need to put it on the southern side opposed to, so it's about choosing the right spot for the right plant as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, we've been talking about sort of dry, hot, but what happens when we get that unseasonal rain event that just I'm just
we just had in Canberra, we had a week of rain.
And I'm thinking particularly because I've got these lovely perovskias, the Russian sage, and the ones that were sitting under the eaves that got smashed with all the overflow of water that couldn't cope have just died off because they don't want wet, and they're just unhappy. So, here I am thinking I've planted this garden for the dry and now it's had too much water and it's not happy. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned before about using swales. What other design elements can we put into coping with those rain events that are hitting our dry hardy gardens?
Well, it's about the soil structure. So it's not about, you can water till the cows come home, but if you still need to move that water away from the root system. So again, it's about having good fluctuating soil with rock minerals and things like that. So and you need to move the water away from the plants. And
this is where soil porosity becomes really important.
Yes, yep, no,
so
that's
that
right.
the water goes down to the water table and doesn't just sit underneath the surface.
And gives the plants drainage. So the plants and the root system will take as much water as it needs, and then the water should dissipate and move away. So if there are some issues there, then you can dig a hole, fill the hole with a bucket of water, and see how long that takes to dissipate. If it takes a couple of hours, then that's sort of okay. But if the hole of water is still there by the next day, there's issues, and that's where you put gypsum in the soil and things like that to allow the drainage. And then
breaking the soil up with the gypsum.
Yep, that's right. And gypsum is very good because it doesn't change the pH of the soil, so you can use a lot of it. It does take quite some time for it to work. So it's about getting a good soil root system and a good structure in your soil to allow the soil to hold on to what it needs and then release the rest of it away from the plants.
This has just been so useful, Jackie, to really get these practical tips. And I think all of our home gardeners and designers are really starting to think about how they putting this into place. So I want to ask you, as we start to wrap up, so advice or wisdom, so particular points that you might say, if lots of our designers listen to our podcast, what sort of advice or wisdom would you impart to a designer who's looking at, making their designs more drought hardy?
Too many plants. I'm a less than more kind of person, and so the plants then have good airflow, and you're not trying to jam as many plants into the same spot, and give it a good balance. So it can be, some exotics might need more moisture in the leaves and that sort of stuff, but it's just a good balance overall, I think. Yeah. Without putting too many plants in the garden, because then what happens is on a design they're squashed in because the design needs to fill the void on the paper, and then 2 years down the track, as a maintenance person, I've got to go and pull every second one out because they've overgrown. So that can be poor plant choices as well, or just choosing. You don't need to jam everything in, and once you have a crowded garden, it looks unsightly to the eye and it looks messy, but you can't pick what the problem is. And so I think if we just have a little bit of a void in the garden and some good airflow and some good spaces, that makes to me a very much more aesthetic garden to look at.
Actually, that's a good point, because Sachi and I were talking earlier about potentially offering to our clients a pioneer planting plan that gets the main planting plan established. So you basically have a planting plan that gets you through to where you actually want your garden to be in about 3 or 5 years' time.
Yep.
So is that a solution where, at least if you've got these pioneer plants that are just really sacrificial,
yes,
could that then lead what we wanted to achieve, to get that sort of a bit more density that's happening under the soil,
get your canopy established?
Yeah, and this is where wattles can be very, very good in because they grow fast and they add nitrogen to the soil, and they also are what we call the primary plants. So then therefore they are nurturing and protecting the plants that are the slower growing plants that are in the sun. We see that in the paddocks in the country, where we see a grove of eucalypts with wattles all around them. So in 10 to 15 years' time, the wattles have died and they've added all the nitrogen, and then the eucalypts are ready to go. So it's a common farming practice that we've used for a long time, and we could definitely do that in our own gardens.
And in fact, you'll see it after fires as well. The first things that come up are the wattles. And
the wattles,
those listeners that don't know what wattles are, they're an acacia species that are often native to Australia. Now, I'm going to ask the last question, because we've got to wrap up, because we've spent a lot of time talking about this fascinating topic. So what are your last tips and tricks that you might want to share with home gardeners wanting to prepare their garden for drought, Jackie?
Soil preparation, rock minerals, all of that sort of stuff, like compost, organic matter. And I think one of the most important things is to research what you want to put into the garden. Think about the site aspects. See about where the sun hits that spot during the day, whether it's a winter spot, a summer spot, fertilising at the right time of year. And seaweed solution is also a very, very good thing, because a seaweed solution helps the soil. It's not a fertiliser. So I think the take-home thing for me would be to look after your soils. And if you have good soils, you have good plants.
That sounds like a very sensible thing to do. Any last thoughts from you, Flo, as we wrap up?
I think, as I've been listening to Jackie, and I've been kind of storing all these tips and tricks into my own design repertoire, so I want to emphasise what I think I've got my top 3 takeaways from Jackie today. First one, if it grows well, multiply it. I reckon that's great because that's applicable to everybody in any gardening zone across the world. The second one is I feel really satisfied that it's not just about cactus and succulents, that there's a very wide choice of plant foliage and forms that are suitable for dry hardy gardens. And thirdly, if you get your soil structure right, you can probably plant a lot more diversity of species than we otherwise first thought. So they're my key takeaways, Jackie. I hope I've done you justice.
Absolutely, you have. Yep, that's perfect. Yep.
Fantastic. And it's just been so interesting. So thank you so much for joining us today.
On that note, we'll wrap up. So drop us a follow on Instagram or Spotify. Find us on Apple Podcasts and we will talk to you again soon. See you later.